Well, hello. Here we are again for now it's the third edition of the new Unregistered Live, which is following on from the Unregistered podcast, but it's quite different. One thing, it's a live stream, as we know, but it will also be focused on my academic work, my scholarship, and in particular, the courses we are teaching at Unregistered Academy, which is courses taught by me and several other scholars and academics and professors and other teachers. So we're going to be focusing on the material at the Academy in this show henceforward, but it will always be, of course, linked to, connected to, and made relevant to today's events, the news of today, what's going on. And one of the major objectives I've always had with this work at the Academy is to illuminate for people the deeper issues, the history, the philosophy of the news today, the issues and the events that we are all talking about. And so that's what we'll be doing tonight, because we have in recent weeks, once again, new conversations about who will run American foreign policy. And I will say that the first two sessions, the first two editions of this show were focused on the history of US foreign policy. Tonight will actually be a bit of a twist. We will be talking about the neoconservatives, who are famous almost exclusively for their ideas about American foreign policy and geopolitics. But we're actually going to be looking at their views on domestic issues, cultural issues, what are sometimes called social issues, which is never discussed when we talk about who the neoconservatives are and were, what they were about, what they want, and why they've succeeded in enacting various policies over the last 50 years that have changed the world. Most of us think for the worse, but they are still very, very active, as I'm sure most people watching this are aware. Bill Kristol is only the most prominent member of this group of intellectuals that we call neoconservatives. But there are many who are aligned with Kristol and the Kristol family, the Bodoritz family. They tend to congregate around Commentary magazine. And this is, if you want to go deeper into the neoconservatives, that's where you start. They have run that magazine, neoconservative editors, and these are the leading figures of the neoconservative movement since the 1950s. And it's always been a leading, very important intellectual magazine in American politics. But it has been a neoconservative outlet for its whole career as a publication. So go to Commentary if you want to look deeper into this. And we will actually be looking at a couple of articles from Commentary that were quite formative or seminal in the formation of the neoconservative movement. And when I say the movement, and this is quite interesting, and I suppose it's bitterly ironic, when we talk about neoconservatism and neoconservatives or neocons all the time, right? They are the great boogeyman for pretty much everyone who is not an establishment Republican, or I guess an establishment Democrat. So this includes MAGA. I mean, within MAGA, within the Trump movement, neoconservatism is a bad word. Neocons, at least among, I think, the rank and file of MAGA, and even I think even Trump himself has used the word in a derogatory way before. It's not cool to be a neocon. Certainly not among the left. The left were the first to point out who they were and what their influence was during the Bush administration and the Iraq War, and rightly pointed to neoconservative thinkers inside the White House and around the White House, quite literally, in the lobbyist headquarters that surround Capitol Hill. The left, of course, and I mean not the Democratic Party left, but I mean from Bernie Sanders leftward, actual socialists, actual Marxists, actual anarchists of the left were the first, really, I think, to ring the alarms, or one of the first, I should say, let me caveat that, one of the first to ring the alarm about who the neocons were and what they were doing back in the early 2000s. The other group, of course, that has probably been more focused on neocon influence, I would say libertarians who are concerned about foreign policy, anti-war people, generally have had neocon on their lips for 2 decades now. What I was going to say about the darkly ironic part of the neoconservative, what's called a movement, is that it is made up of, gosh, I mean, maybe fewer than 100 people. Maybe fewer than 100 people. We are talking about intellectuals, mostly who live in New York City, most of whom are Jewish, often come out of the universities. They are former leftists and liberals. We'll talk about that in a minute. But there has never been any popular movement whatsoever behind neoconservatives. There's no one in the country, as I know of, voted for neoconservatism. Most Americans don't know what I'm talking about right now. Most Americans actually have not heard the term. I think it's really limited to people who are fairly sophisticated politically, like those watching this show right now. It's an amazing phenomenon because they've been around, as I said, for more than 50 years, 60 years, really, as an influential political force. Just a handful of nerdy Jewish intellectuals from Manhattan, again, with no popular base whatsoever. I can think of multitudes of right-wing movements that had thousands or even millions of people who were in the streets marching or voting or participating, joining organizations. Not so for the neocons. They're just a bunch of thinkers who happen to have taken the ear of many presidents and senators and congresspeople and have, as I said, successfully lobbied to enact several of their policies, most notably the Iraq War, but that is only one of many of their successes, you could say. So in our course at Unregistered Academy on neoconservatism, we have an entire course where we drill down on all the details of this fascinating and one might say bizarre movement, but certainly highly important movement in American intellectual and political history. So I urge you, if you're not already a member, to become a member so that you can watch that course. And if you are a member, this is your chance. It's well worth your time to understand much more deeply what's actually going on today in American politics, and in particular on foreign policy. So, we, as I said, everyone who is any kind of a dissident at all on the left or the right hates the neocons. This is standard fare. And yet I rarely, if ever, have heard a good definition of who the neocons were or are by people who use that term. And I've actually come to believe that they are not so exceptional or unusual, that they actually represent a fairly broad, mainstream, almost consensus view on what America should be in the world. So tonight, in this live stream, we will actually be focusing not on their views on foreign policy, which have been much discussed and which we go into in tremendous detail in the course at the Academy. We're going to talk about aspects of their ideology, their worldview that are, pretty much never discussed. And I'm discussing them not just because they are unusual, but because I think they're vitally important in understanding their broader worldview, which includes their views on the leadership of the United States in the world. Okay, so let's begin at the beginning. The neocons, and by the way, it is perfectly acceptable to label them this freely, as I am doing, because they themselves invented the term and have called themselves neoconservatives. So this is absolute, and it's very clear who they are. They're very identifiable. Again, I said it's a few dozen people that we're talking about. They began as an identifiable intellectual movement in the 1930s when they were in college. The handful of those who became leaders of this movement were in college at Columbia University or CCNY. They were all sons, actually there were a couple of women, children of Jewish immigrants in New York, mostly Brooklyn, mostly one neighborhood in Brooklyn, which is Brownsville, interestingly. And there's an absolutely fascinating story about Norman Podhoretz, who was one of the godfathers of neoconservatism, growing up as a boy in Brooklyn and Brownsville and being attacked by the black youth who had recently moved into the neighborhood. And he discusses how that influenced his views on everything, including world affairs. And I argue, and have argued elsewhere, but I argue in the course, I lay out the case in the course that it actually, I believe, laid the foundation for what became the Iraq War. That within the neoconservative mind, that black people became conflated with brown people, who became conflated with Muslims and Arabs at the very same time that neoconservatives, this is in the 1950s and 60s, were becoming aware of Israel and thinking of it as a victim state. So the rest of that argument is laid out in the course on neoconservatism. We also discuss at length in the course the Wolfowitz Doctrine, which in many ways was a precise roadmap for American foreign policy of the last 20 to 30 years. Project for a New American Century, which was a prediction and a call for what became the War on Terror. We discuss at length all of their views on foreign policy, which is the most famous aspect of their thinking, and one might argue the most influential, because that is where they've had the most success. But these people, the neoconservatives, have always had very strong ideas about all forms of politics, including what we call domestic or cultural matters. Now, I mentioned one of the founders of the movement, Norman Podhoretz. His son, John Podhoretz, is currently the editor of Commentary. And so it's a family affair, neoconservatism. Then there's the Kristols. Irving Kristol he's called the godfather of neoconservatism. His son, Bill Kristol, I'm sure most, if not all of you, know about and are well aware of. Bill is now currently considered, he's the editor of I forget the name of it, the New Statesman. What's the Neocon magazine? Anyway, he's considered, and has been for quite a while, sort of the leading figure among neoconservatives. And he arguably is the one outside the White House in 2003 who had the president's ear more than any other public intellectual, although there were neocons working inside the Bush administration as well. Wolfowitz was one, Doug Feith is another. It's almost non-controversial to say that the neocons directed, or you might say at least inspired, the foreign policies of the Bush administration, the W. Bush administration, and in particular, of course, the invasion of Iraq. It has been argued by most people that that was their idea, and that they succeeded in persuading Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld to go for it. So outsized influence, just a handful of eggheads from Brooklyn managed to send the United States into a massive catastrophic war. They've had other influence in other areas as well. But tonight, as I said, we will not talk about their views on geopolitics and world affairs and foreign policy and who lives and who dies abroad, whether we go to a war or not, whether we invade countries and attempt to change the regimes in those countries. These are classic, common neoconservative ideas about foreign policy. We're going to talk about their views on domestic politics and also economics. But we're coming at it from an angle that I think will be surprising for most people, because the neocons are an interesting group intellectually. This is one of the reasons I enjoy teaching them, talking about them, studying them. They are, like me, I would say, primarily interested in cultural issues. Or I should say, they, like me, are primarily interested in viewing politics through culture or as culture. So we are now going to look at the views of the founders of the neoconservative movement on capitalism, but you'll see it's not an economic analysis, and sex, which I have argued throughout my career is the clearest window into a person's thinking. So we're going to look at what the neoconservatives thought about sex, and I will argue or show you, I think, how important it is, their views on sex and sexuality, how important it is in determining their views on such things as the Iraq War. So let's begin with the Godfather himself, the man, Irving Kristol. He was born in 1920, as I said, in Brownsville, Brooklyn. He died outside of Washington, D.C. in 2009. He, of course, moved from New York to D.C. in the second half of his life for some obvious reasons. But, clearly it's to be closer to the think tanks, many of which were led by his son, Bill, which were gaining increasing influence in the White House from the Reagan administration onward, and of course peaking in the Bush II administration. Now, Irving Kristol, I'm sure many of you have heard me discuss this before, was a member as a young man, as a college student. He was a member of the Young People's Socialist League, otherwise known as YPSL, YPSL, when he was a student at City College of New York City. This was the very same organization that my parents belonged to about 10 years after he was a member of YPSL. YPSL was an offshoot of the Socialist Party of America, which earlier in the century was the largest radical left party in the country's history. The YPSL youth offshoot, though, took a more radical bent than the Socialist Party proper, and were essentially taken over by Trotskyists, disciples of Leon Trotsky, the Bolshevik Russian revolutionary who was exiled by Stalin in a rivalry. It was not ideological. It was Stalin's attempt to dispose of his chief rival, which he did. He was exiled to Mexico, where he was assassinated by one of Stalin's assassins with an ice pick through the brain. So Trotsky's politics, there will be some Trotskyists maybe who see this who will get upset with me, but being the son of Trotskyists and having studied Trotsky and having been a member myself very early in my life of the Trotskyist organization, I think I can say with some confidence that I know what I'm talking about, in that his politics, Trotsky's politics, essentially and in the end and effectively were not substantially different than Stalin's. No one would argue they were substantially different than Lenin's, which is to say, we are talking about an authoritarian, statist, socialist, revolutionary form of government and economics. Highly authoritarian, collectivist, and I think most of us know the rest of the story. But that's who Irving Kristol and some, not all. There's a misconception that all of the neocons were originally Trotskyists. That's not true. Kristol was the main one who was a Trotskyist. The others, as far as we can tell, were sort of left liberal types, certainly on the left, socialistic at least, but not actual Trotskyists, meaning they weren't revolutionary. They weren't advocating, like Trotsky, an armed revolution in all the bourgeois countries of the world. So that's where they started, though, on the left as socialists, and that's the most important thing to think about as we move through this, or it's certainly one of the most interesting things to think about and to consider. Irving Kristol married Gertrude Himmelfarb, who herself is or was a prominent and important neoconservative intellectual. They did a lot of work together, and she's very well published, just like him, and quite influential on a number of issues within the neoconservative movement. Also a Brooklyn Jew, or at least a New York Jew. Not sure which borough she's from. He worked after he left the Trotskyist movement. He stopped being a Trotskyist, a Marxist, a revolutionary after college, so late 40s. And in the 1950s, he worked with the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which we now know, after the files were declassified, was a front group run by the CIA. That, of course, is not inconsequential or insignificant in understanding the career and ideology of not just Kristol, but his entire movement. He then, most importantly and famously, became writer and editor for Commentary, which I discussed, which is still the Neocon magazine. Encounter, Public Interest, and National Interest, which are all right of center political intellectual magazines in the 50s and 60s. He was also a fellow for a long time at the American Enterprise Institute, another right-wing think tank, which is somewhat interesting in that I think it's the only think tank that really does merge kind of some real libertarian thinkers with hardcore, I would call statist, collectivist right-wingers like Kristol. But he was there at the AEI. He is the one who said this, that is probably one of most quoted phrases on the right. People on the right or people who are anti-liberal love to quote this. This is Kristol. He said, "A neoconservative is a liberal who has been mugged by reality." And that really is the theme, as I argue in the course at the Academy. Going back to Norman Podoritz's article, his story about being beaten up by black boys in Brooklyn when he was growing up, literally mugged. Norman Podoritz and others were literally mugged in New York City. And all of them discussed those events, especially Podoritz, at great length, as formative or even pivotal in their politics, their political worldviews. They realized that those other people weren't actually good people, or they thought unlike their liberal Jewish friends and siblings and relatives who loved the Negro at the time, the Podoritzes and Kristols were the ones who went the other direction. When racial liberalism was forming during and after World War II, and liberals were being taught to think of Negroes as victims who needed to be helped by whites and who were essentially virtuous, the Jewish left, that's where the Jewish left went. And the neocons were the Jews in the left who didn't go in that direction. And they say it's because they were literally beaten up by black people in the streets, literally mugged by reality. So, of course, as I've said, and we all know, he's the father of Bill Kristol, who is moved, and this is a very important data point to also keep in mind. Again, they all started either on the hard left or within the Democratic Party. And then I think Kristol moved into the Democratic Party in the 50s. They were all basically aligned with the Democratic Party for the first two or three decades, meaning all the way to through the 70s, and even worked inside as staffers, many of them, within the Democratic Party, and identified themselves as liberals. Bill Kristol was born later. He's a little older than me, and he didn't come of age politically until the early 70s. And so I'm sorry, I take it back. Even Bill, that's right. He began his career, I think, as a campaign, like a volunteer when he was a teenager, a volunteer for, was it McGovern's campaign in 72? He started out as a Democrat too. They all started out as Democrats. Then in the 1980s, and this story is told in detail in the course, so I'm not going to go all the way into it here. With Reagan, they all moved sort of en masse into the Republican Party for ideas you can sort of imagine, because at that time in the 80s, the Republicans were perceived as the more hawkish, more interventionist, more globalist, or we might say the more imperialist party. And the Democrats, this is of course following Jimmy Carter, who was seen, not entirely accurately, as a pacifist, non-interventionist, etc. So the neocons in the 80s chose to move to the Republicans, where they remained until the arrival of one Donald J. Trump, who, of course, called into question several of the foundational precepts of the neoconservative movement, like, should the United States conduct regime change wars? Should it seek to overthrow governments in other countries? Should it invade and occupy other countries and remake the cultures and politics of those countries, like was attempted in Afghanistan and Iraq with zero success? And so the neocons, when Trump began to say these things, calling into question, and again, I don't want to talk about what Trump actually did, but he certainly did raise questions which was absolutely taboo for people in the foreign policy establishment, especially neoconservatives. Should the United States continue to support NATO? I mean, just absolutely appalling for the neocons to hear that. So what happened? As I'm sure most, if not all of you know, they all moved then en masse back to the Democrats. And in particular, they coalesced around Hillary Clinton. And in fact, Robert Kagan, who is, I believe, an outstanding historian, who is considered, I think, rightly to be kind of the most intellectually sophisticated and maybe important of the neocons. He's a historian, as I said. He's written several, I think, quite brilliant books, and I actually think he's quite right in many of his arguments. And if you take our courses on U.S. foreign policy and the history of them, you will see how I think the neocon analysis of the history of U.S. foreign policy is correct, which is that the U.S. has always been a globalist empire from the founders to the present. So that's where I think they're right. Now, they, of course, think that's a good thing, and politically, I don't. But as historical analysis and political analysis about what actually has happened in the minds of all the presidents and senators who have run U.S. foreign policy since the 1790s, yes, I agree with the neocons. It has been a globalist, imperialist project in the minds of even the founding, especially the founding fathers, from the beginning. That's Robert Kagan. He became, and that they use that, of course, Kagan and the neocons use that as an argument to continue it. They say, oh, the Iraq War, therefore, was an all-American thing to do because the founding fathers always wanted to do such a thing. To which I have said that that's partly correct. I mean, the founders were certainly, as I said, always interested in a global empire, in expanding America across the earth. And there's ample evidence for this, and you'll see it in our courses at the Academy. But that to them is the reason that we should continue. If John Adams and Thomas Jefferson launched an imperialist war against the Barbary coast of North Africa and overthrow the regime of Tripoli, the government of Tripoli, and installed an America-friendly king, which is what Thomas Jefferson did on Adams's support, one of the first things he did as president, then that's what we should do elsewhere. And in fact, guess where they did do such a thing, or attempted to? In Tripoli, in Libya, just a few years ago. So that's, now my argument is that, well, yes, they've always intended a global empire, but look what it's gotten us. But this is politics, what I'm talking about now. The analysis is correct, which is that every US president has subscribed to what we now think of as the neoconservative vision of America as leader of the world. They found, the neocons, when Trump came along, they found that their true home was always the Democratic Party. And on that, I agree with them, and I've always agreed with them. The Democrats, and this is another side point that's in several of our courses on foreign policy, that the Democratic Party, liberal Democrats in particular, are the ones who built what I call the American empire. And beginning with, from Wilson onward, but you could even go back further than that. And so that's, I think, and even Kagan has said this, I think Kristol has said this, they know the historical legacy of the Democrats is much closer to theirs, much closer to their thinking. And so that's that, and for other reasons concerning Trump, that's why they have coalesced around the Democratic Party and around Hillary Clinton in particular. He received, George W. Bush gave him the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2002, just before the Iraq War. Interesting moment. Okay, so briefly sketch it out. I mean, I've sort of said this, but I think this is not going to be news to anyone watching this. But of course, the neocon vision of the world, it's quite complex in its details, and we go through all the documents of the neoconservative movement in the course. But the broad sketch is, of course, that the United States should essentially be everywhere in the world, militarily, economically, politically, and culturally. That the United States should remake the cultures of every country on earth to make every one of them more like the United States. Again, politically, they, of course, want to promote democracy. They want what you might call liberal democratic capitalism, although there's a major caveat, which we're about to talk about there. They want everyone in the world, from Bangladesh to South Africa to the Philippines, to hold what are called classical liberal values. Now, and of course, they are prepared, even eager, to accomplish that task militarily, or at least at first militarily, through invasion and conquest and colonization of those regions. And this is not an exaggeration if you read, as we do in the course, Project for a New American Century document that appeared shortly before 9/11. It's very clear that's what they're calling for. It's global colonization, enforced by a worldwide, what they call a military constabulary, which is just military bases everywhere. And we now have 800 military bases across the world now. Much of that is from neocon influence. It was their idea to have that many. They even want more. So, right, I mean, globalist, imperialist, there's whatever synonym you prefer there, American exceptionalist. I think this is clear, and I think it's well known what their foreign policy ideas are. Does anyone here know what their ideas on capitalism were and are? What do these guys think about capitalism? What do they think about cultural issues like sex? No one, right? It's not ever discussed. Well, let's do that right now, because I think that's pretty important, since they have such power and have had such power in the American national government throughout my lifetime. So here's Kristol, the godfather of neoconservatism. This is his book. And again, I told you that they identified themselves as neoconservatives. So it is absolutely appropriate to call them that. His book was called Reflections of a Neoconservative in 1979. And in it, he sketches out his whole worldview. It's quite useful, and I wish more people read this. Now, they call themselves conservatives, and they at the time were aligned with the Republican Party. And it is often thought, certainly among, I would call low information liberals, that Republicans are all for free markets. The Republicans on economics are just all libertarian. And I'm sure that this audience knows better than that. Well, look at what Irving Kristol, the former Trotskyist, now Republican, has to say about capitalism. He says the attitude of neoconservatives to bourgeois society and the bourgeois ethos is one of detached attachment. In the spirit of Tocqueville, neoconservatives do not think that liberal democratic capitalism is the best of all imaginable worlds. It is only the best under the circumstances of all possible worlds. This modest enthusiasm distinguishes neoconservatism from the old right, and here he's talking about what is referred to as the isolationist right of the mid and early 20th century, and the new right. And here he's referring to the Barry Goldwater movement, which morphed into the Ronald Reagan movement just after he wrote this, or at the same time he was writing this. Both of which, he says, are extremely suspicious of capitalism. Now, the new right, the Goldwater and then Reagan movement, what was new about that was that the conservative Republican movement became infiltrated with or aligned with Christian conservatives. In fact, Christian conservatism became a new thing during that time. And of course, for very good reason, Christians who understand what Christianity is, and especially those who call themselves conservative, have had at least ambivalent attitudes toward capitalism. For reasons Irving Kristol will spell out, I think, correctly. Neoconservatism, he says, is inclined to the belief that a predominantly market economy, just how predominant is a matter of some disagreement, is a necessary, if not sufficient, precondition for a liberal society. It also sees a market economy economy is favorable to economic growth. Okay, so for just practical purposes, and this is most important, I think you can see this here, for purposes of national strength, which again is a chief neocon value, they want the United States of America to be strong. We need capitalism, a market economy, or a basis of a market economy. So they're almost, I read this, and you'll see why I think this. I read this as essentially a concession that they'd rather not have capitalism, that they prefer something much more collectivist and statist and much more governed and ruled and regulated. But this, they understand, is the only way, and I mean this, to get enough tanks and bombs produced to invade all the countries they wanted to invade. You need a massive economic base to do the foreign policy that the neocons have wanted to do, clearly, right? You need a very, very wealthy country to send the army and to have permanent military bases all over the globe. We now know this from our budget, which is in the negative trillions, largely because of this, because of exactly that reason, the reasons that for the ideas that Irving Kristol put forward successfully. So I read this in that way, and this, I think, his socialist roots are showing here. There's a real, almost visceral discomfort with capitalism, and why is that? And let's look. I love this. To me, it's one of the most interesting. Not only is it illuminating about who the neocons are, but I think it's a fascinating analysis of capitalism that I largely agree with this analysis. The politics that comes out of it, no, is the opposite of mine. But that's not important. What's important is to understand who they are. And what's fascinating is, even though most people think of us as mortal enemies, which we are, I suppose, on all politics, really, I agree with them on their major analyses. So here we go. Neoconservatives believe in the importance of economic growth, not out of any enthusiasm for the material goods of this world. They're also ascetics, the neocons. That's what he's expressing there, which is a classic, I would say, commitment and even personality style of the left, which I know very well, having been born into them. And so, we have no enthusiasm for the material stuff that comes out of capitalism. Incredible thing to say, right? Because everyone else, that's what we most care about. I mean, how many people they think of capitalism as good only because it increases national strength, not because we can order lunch and have it delivered to our door, right? But that's the neocons. That again is where they are very typical of leftists, very much socialist thinking here. Real socialists, as I've argued in many places, are the true ascetics, the true Puritans of today. And this is where I think you're seeing his socialist roots again. So we don't care about the material goods of capitalism, but because neocons see economic growth as indispensable for social and political stability, that's what they care about. It's one of the strangest mindsets I can think of. It is the prospect of economic growth that has made it possible to think, against the grain of pre-modern political thought, of democracy as a viable and enduring socio-political system. Neoconservatives are not libertarian in the sense, say, that Milton Friedman and Friedrich von Hayek are. A conservative welfare state, what was once called a, quote, social insurance state, is perfectly consistent with the neoconservative perspective. I wonder how many people here have even ever thought of a conservative welfare state. What a concept. Who talks about that? I'm being mostly serious when I say that. That is a very unusual concept, and it's certainly not something you hear talked about. Not a phrase, a conservative welfare state. What would that be? One could say that it's what nationalist populism is now, and what at least major parts of MAGA are, that they want the government intervening heavily in the economy to benefit the native-born working class. But that's not what the neocons are about, as you'll see in a moment. They are not Steve Bannon. And this is, again, why Steve Bannon hates them. Steve Bannon, I would say, is probably the leading anti-neocon within the MAGA movement, and that's not insignificant. Steve Bannon believes in that kind of he would call it a conservative welfare state, and that's how he would describe it. Also, the kind of welfare state that's been enacted in Hungary under Orban. Things like giving payment, even straight up checks from the government to families that have a certain number of children to promote the raising of children and family growth, etc. So is a state. So he says that he says that a conservative welfare state is perfectly consistent with the neoconservative perspective. So he's not ruling out giving benefits to Americans, for conservative purposes. But what he's really getting at is different. So is a state that takes a degree of responsibility, here it is, for helping to shape the preferences that people exercise in a free market to, quote, elevate them, if you will. Now, let's just pause and take that sentence in. You don't see Americans very often speak in this way, which I would say is the way of a czar in the Soviet Union. I mean, meaning like a czar from Russian history, a czar, a leader, a culture leader in a communist country. This is totalitarian thinking, right? This is the government. The idea is that the government should shape our ideas, should actively shape the ideas of the citizenry. That's my definition of totalitarian. It's not authoritarianism. Authoritarianism would be holding a gun to your head and forcing you to say certain things. This is getting the people to believe, to think in certain ways through the state. Let's read that again. So a state that takes a degree of responsibility for helping to shape the preferences that people exercise in a free market to elevate them, if you will. That's the state. That's the kind of conservative welfare state they really want. That's how they define welfare, is about the state teaching us how to spend our money and how to live our lives. Now, what's really remarkable is the assumption that the people who run the government have a better idea about how anyone should live their lives. Like, what is it about being a government official that makes you a better expert on how I should spend my money at the grocery store? Because it's all moral, right? And politicians, of course, are typically morally self-selecting. I'm good and I know what's good, and therefore I should run the country. Anyway, so it's not just elitism. People would read that sentence and just be sort of shocked by the elitism of it. And that's certainly there, but it's much more, it's deeper than that. It's not just totalitarian, it's the belief, and I believe this is the core of neoconservative thinking, the belief that the government, the state, the nation state, should shape the minds of its citizenry through coercion. So again, remember their origin. Remember where Irving Kristol started politically. His hero was the leader of the Russian Revolution. Okay. Next, we're going to look at, his final thoughts on capitalism. This is really, he brings it home here. Neoconservatives, moreover, believe that it is natural, and this is just my favorite. It is natural for people to want their preferences to be elevated. He's saying that you, me, all of us right here on this live stream, everyone in the world, in fact, I want my preferences to be elevated. I want someone else to elevate my preferences. And he actually thinks I want, and you want, and we all secretly want the government to elevate, to change our preferences. And it's down to what you buy at the supermarket. Every dollar you spend, that's what he's getting at. I mean, Then he says this, the current version of liberalism, he's talking about the Democratic Party circa the 1970s. This is Carter, right? He's not exactly accurate in his depiction of it, but his point is important here. The current version of liberalism, which prescribes massive government intervention in the marketplace, correct? I mean, that's correct. But an absolute laissez-faire attitude toward manners and morals, which is not correct, but neocons believe that, strikes neoconservatives as representing a bizarre inversion of priorities. So what is he prescribing here? He wants to invert that. He wants less intervention in the marketplace, although he still wants a lot, you'll see. But he wants massive government intervention, I take it. He wants massive government intervention. Those are the words here. And he wants to invert this, right? He wants massive government intervention toward manners and morals. Massive government intervention toward manners and morals. So I hope the term totalitarian is making sense to people. And again, I'm not doing this to dismiss or denigrate as an epithet or anything. And as I said, I agree in large part on much of their analyses. And I think, as I said, Robert Kagan is one of the greatest historians in my field. And I agree with him largely on his analysis of the sweep of American history. I'm here to explain these very important, very unknown and misunderstood people who continue. And right now, one of the reasons we're doing this course or doing this live stream is because right now we are all jockeying one way or another to keep them out of the White House. And they're trying to get their way into the White House, or at least have influence over the White House, or have neocon adjacent people in the White House. And so far, there are many of Trump's appointments who are certainly at least neocon adjacent. Marco Rubio is just one of them, but actually all of his foreign policy people would be quite at home at a neocon convention. But so we know about their foreign policy wishes, their beliefs, and their actual policies that they've enacted. How is that connected to this totalitarian vision of your life and the relationship between the state and the private lives of citizens? That's another thing. I just want you to start thinking about that. Why are we doing this tonight? Why am I showing you all this? Because, they didn't really succeed in this score, except in one important way. And this, again, is largely unknown, but it is affected. If you have a child who's ever been in a public school, or you yourself has ever been in a public school in this country, you were affected by these people. Norman Podhoretz wrote an article in Commentary in the 1970s called The Idea of a Common Culture, in which he argued and began an argument, which they took up later, to inject into the curricula of every public school in the country, powerful indoctrination into American ideology, American worldview, meaning their neoconservative worldview. So, and this became the Common Core under Bush, and then it became Race to the Top under Obama. And as of today, every public school in this country, from K through 12, has elements of this program in which they are taught how to be good American citizens. And that idea literally came from Commentary Magazine, Norman Podhoretz, the Neoconservatives. So that is as coercive as it gets in changing the minds of the citizenry, isn't it? Because those children are being forced, as we all were, forced to go to those schools. We had no choice. Our parents didn't have any choice. Our parents would go to prison if they didn't send us to those schools. And so we're prisoners in those schools in which they taught us whatever they wanted to. And part of what they taught us were the ideas of Irving Kristol, that we should be loyal, dedicated Americans, deferential to authority, that we should see serving in the military in foreign wars abroad as the highest honor. etc. Yeah, I wrote an article about this in New York Magazine 10, 20 years ago, about Obama continuing the Common Core program in the schools and renaming it Race to the Top, and you can look that up. Arnie Duncan was his education secretary who enacted this thing, and it's still there. My son began his public school career right when that happened, and he ended it a few years ago. So my son was a victim, I suppose, of it throughout his from K through 12. So I have a personal stake in that one. So we're about to talk about sex, and I hope that's okay. And people might be wondering, why on earth are we talking about sex? And we're talking about the neoconservatives. What? It's supposed to be a course or a live stream on the Iraq War and military spending or what? No, I do have argued that one's views on sex and sexuality are always indicative of one's broader politics. They're always connected. So let's take a look. What on earth does Irving Kristol have to say about sex? Okay. Well, he thought so much about it and so passionately about it that he wrote an article in the New York Times on this very subject in the 1971. So it's quite a remarkable document, fascinating in multiple ways. But most importantly, I think it does help us understand who the neocons were and are, and most importantly, what the Iraq War was really about. He says, no society can be utterly indifferent to the ways its citizens publicly entertain themselves. Bear baiting and cockfighting are prohibited only in part out of compassion for the suffering animals. The main reason they were abolished was because it was felt that they debased and brutalized the citizenry who flocked to witness such spectacles. And the question we face with regard to pornography and obscenity is whether, now that they have such strong legal protection from the Supreme Court, this is after the Supreme Court basically allowed pornography to flourish because it basically removed obscenity laws. We are, after all, not dealing with one passing incident, one book or one play or one movie. We are dealing with a general tendency that is suffusing our entire culture. One of the reasons it will remain a problem is that obscenity is not merely about sex, and here he goes, any more than science fiction is about science. Science fiction, as every student of the genre knows, and I bet you a lot of people watching this live stream know what he's talking about, is actually a peculiar vision of power. What it is really about is politics. I'm not a science fiction fan, but from what I know about science fiction, it is often, possibly always, really about politics. Well, that's what he's saying pornography is. The use of pornography. It's really about politics. Meaning what, though? What does that mean? He says the basic psychological fact, sorry, this got blocked out a bit. The basic psychological fact about pornography and obscenity is that it appeals to and provokes a kind of, I can't even read it myself, kind of regression, right? The sexual pleasure, one second here. The basic psychological fact about pornography and obscenity is that it appeals to and provokes a kind of sexual regression. The sexual pleasure one gets from pornography and obscenity is autoerotic, and here's the key moment here, and infantile. It's infantile. That's the real problem with it. Put bluntly, it is a masturbatory exercise of the imagination when it is not masturbation pure and simple. Now, people who masturbate, this is Irving Kristol, the godfather of neoconservatism, writing in the New York Times about masturbation. And he's about to explain to you correctly how important this is. Now, people who masturbate do not get bored with masturbation, just as sadists don't get bored with sadism. And voyeurs don't get bored with voyeurism. In other words, infantile sexuality is not only a permanent temptation for the adolescent or even the adult, it can quite easily become a permanent, self-reinforcing neurosis. It is because of an awareness of the possibility of regression toward the infantile condition, a regression which is always open to us, that all the codes of sexual conduct ever devised by the human race take such a dim view of autoerotic activities and try to discourage autoerotic fantasies. Now, in this last part, he is largely correct. If you look at the history of civilizations, and in particular modern civilizations, almost exclusively modern civilizations, yes, indeed, you see constant war against what was called onanism or self-pleasuring, and then eventually was called masturbation in the 19th century by governments, state governments across certainly the West, the industrial West, and especially in the modern era, in particular in the 19th and 20th centuries, governments went after masturbation, as did churches, sort of major cultural institutions, schools. He is right about that. And he is saying, and here he's, so it's interesting. I had not noticed this before. He's also a Freudian. He comes out of Marx, but he also comes out of Freud. This is very much a Freudian analysis here. That's how Freud thought about sexuality, that if one masturbated continually, one was essentially expressing an infantile sexuality, that one never, to Freud, it was natural to grow into heterosexual relations. Also, he thought being gay was also infantile, like a Peter Pan condition. That what is natural is to grow into normal heterosexual procreative relations. So, in other words, masturbation, homosexuality, and even certain kinds of fornication, I guess, for Freud and Freudians like Kristol, they are infantile. It means they were, and this is all made up, by the way. I mean, it might be right, but this is just Freud's theory. I mean, and generations of people after him, this is now fading away, thank God. But among, in particular, intellectuals, in particular in New York City, in particular Jewish intellectuals in New York City, they almost all were influenced by Marx and especially Freud at the time. So that's where this is coming from. But it merges with, interestingly, this political worldview, which requires us to not be children in that way. And what is he talking about? What is masturbation and why is it a problem for governments? Because when you're masturbating, or sex in general, that's not procreative, that's just fun, is only for you. It's selfish. It's self-interested. Every government, every state, every nation requires selflessness. It requires us to merge our identities, at least in part, with the state, to care for it, to think of it as us, right? So that why? When we think of it as us, I am America. America is me. And, Americans, actually, many of them do. That's what they think of. Right? That's how they think, right? When you merge your identity with the nation state, what does that mean when the nation state is at war? It means you go to war, because that's you at war. America is you. So you are willing to go to war. Masturbation, homosexuality, meaning just recreational sex, just fun. What on earth does that serve collectively for the nation state? How does America? It doesn't. Young men jerking off is not young men signing up for service. It is not young men working in a factory to produce things that can produce national strength. This comes from Freud. It merges with Marxism and finds its fullest expression in neoconservatism. And this is why I'm grateful for Irving Kristol and Norman Podhoretz and all the rest of them for being such outstanding intellectuals. Also, I love reading these guys because they said everything about their thoughts. They left nothing secret at all, and they published it in the New York Times. Okay, so now what on earth does this have to do with the Iraq War and all their other ideas about U.S. global hegemony? Let's just keep going. So he's going to talk about pornography now. Oh, whoops. I was on the wrong place. Going to talk about masturbation and pornography. He really wants to drill down on this masturbation issue. And he's right. It is this important. I just happen to take a different side on the issue. Masturbation is indeed a perfectly natural autoerotic activity, as so many sexologists blandly assure us today. He doesn't even like it at all, does he? And it is precisely because it is so perfectly natural that it can be so dangerous to the mature or maturing person if it's not controlled or sublimated. By the way, sublimation is a term invented by Freud. It's about the channeling of sexual energies into productive labor and into service to the civilization, like military service. That's a Freudian term for it. That's what it is, sublimation. That's what he's saying. So take your energy to masturbate and channel it, sublimate it into productive or nationalistic labor in some ways. He then says, what is at stake is civilization and humanity, nothing less. Ladies and gentlemen, yes, this is saying that masturbation, the issue of masturbation, puts at stake civilization itself. Freud thought so, and I think so too. It's just that they like civilization a lot more than I do. That's all. And that's just a value preference. That is not analysis, and that's just my preference. And you should ask yourself what yours is. And it depends on what you want to do in life, honestly, whether you take the side of civilization or what Freud called its dissidence. The idea that, here, next sentence, the idea that, quote, everything is permitted, as Nietzsche put it. This is really misquoting Nietzsche and misconstruing Nietzsche, but it is interesting that he rightly posits Nietzsche as opposite Freud, which is largely correct. And we have a fantastic course on Nietzsche at the Academy as well. We're soon going to have a course on Freud, which on civilization and its discontents, which I can't wait to teach. But the course on Nietzsche, we released it recently. It's available for streaming right now. And you'll see that Kristol definitely grossly misconstrues Nietzsche, but certainly Nietzsche was far more interested in freedom against the restraints of civilization than Freud and Kristol were. In fact, Freud and Kristol are not interested in anything but the restraints. So he says here, the idea that everything is permitted, as Nietzsche put it, rests on the premise of nihilism and has nihilistic implications. I will not pretend that the case against nihilism and for civilization is an easy one to make. So Freud makes that case in Civilization and its Discontents, and we'll have a book course on that soon. We are here confronting the most fundamental of philosophical questions on the deepest levels. But that is precisely my point, that the matter of pornography and obscenity is not a trivial one, and that only superficial minds can take a bland and untroubled view of it. And that concludes our look into the mind of the godfather of neoconservatism, Irving Kristol, concerning his views on capitalism, the state, censorship, and sex. And we now see that he wants the state to control or at least regulate all the major aspects of our culture and our psychology, to remake us into a particular kind of citizen, an absolutely selfless citizen, one who merges his identity with the nation state, with America in this case, and who is ready to serve the nation or serve the nation's economy, and will do so selflessly and enthusiastically because one believes one is an American first, not an individual first. So it's about remaking cultures, it's about remaking minds, remaking psychologies, remaking worldviews, But of course, they are not interested only in Americans. These guys grew up as Trotskyists, as socialists, and as globalist liberals when they were in the Democratic Party. They always cared about all people, not just those who lived under the American flag on this landmass. They believe in their hearts, and I don't think they're cynical, I think this is real. They believe that if people in Bangladesh live like them, they will be much better off. And it is cruel of us to not help them become like us, which might require invading their country. And so this is a global, universalistic, absolutist imperialism. One might say it is a secular version of evangelical Christianity. The belief that all people on earth are one children under one particular God who should behave according to a set of particular rules. One set of rules for all of God's children on earth. I have argued, a few others have argued that progressivism and socialism and left-wing politics have been always a secular version of Christianity. And I think this is one of the most consequential examples of that because of what the neocons have wrought in my lifetime because of this ideology that only they and a few dozen other people hold. So with that, I will take some questions from the chat. I'm sorry, I forgot to get my moderators together. I promise I will have moderators ready for next week. I'm sure some of you guys are here. Weekly Standard, thank you, Tom. That was that's Bill Kristol's. What did I call it? The New Statesman. Yeah, it's the Bill Kristol's magazine is the Weekly Standard. Thank you. Okay, someone thinks that I made all this up. Well, these are published articles. You can find them on the web. This was the New York Times and Commentary magazine and a book published by HarperCollins. So, I mean, this is not okay. That's good though. Okay. He calls their domestic views shape-shifting. That's okay. I will grant you that. I would say that's true over the last 5 years since they moved away from Trump back to the Democrats and have had to sort of, and that's because the woke movement had sort of taken over the Democratic Party and everyone had to sort of pay allegiance to wokeness. So you heard Bill Kristol talking about racial justice and stuff, things he had never talked about or cared about his whole life. You're right about that. You're right about the last 5 years. It's not at all true about Kristol and Podhoretz. They were consistent from the time they sort of announced themselves as neoconservatives. Their domestic policy views have remained from the 50s until the end of their lives. So, but you're right about the recent history. What else do we have here? We haven't talked about, yes, the Jewish issue and their attachment to Israel is covered in depth in the course, of course. But yes, that is a major part of their, I mentioned it, major part of their transformation from socialist, liberal, Democrat to neoconservative was their belief, this is following the 1967 war in particular, that Israel was this sort of perpetual victim that represented them. They weren't identified as Jews really before then, and they didn't care about Israel before then at all. But then they went whole hog as Zionists. And then from that, they connected that to the broader American empire as being constituent. They both needed each other. And this is why they have been probably the leading advocates of supporting Israel since 67. All right. FAP for peace. Yes. Got another mod volunteer. Weekly Standard's done? No, it's not. Is it? Oh, maybe. Okay. We discussed the Trotsky basis at the beginning of this live stream. You can watch it in the recording. All right. With that, I'm going to go watch some football, I think. And appreciate you guys coming. Great crowd. Love this. Check out unregisteredacademy.com for the course on neoconservatism and all the others in which we mentioned these issues. So thank you guys for showing up. Great questions, by the way. Even Posmo, I appreciate your passion. And you did make a good point. So I hope to see you in the school, and the quad, and the courses, and the live stream, and the live courses, which we have. Oh, by the way, next week, I forgot to mention, we will be announcing the next course, and our winter term begins next week. And on this live stream, I'll be announcing the next live course. So that's coming out very soon. Can't wait for that, and look forward to talking to all of you. Okay, thank you all. Peace.